And I mean, huge kudos to Google for publishing such a blog. I think I was told it's the lengthiest blog, at least in Mandiant, Google Mandiant history. And it was trying to really dispel that, even like I said, they look nasty, they look so on. And in reality, they're actually very trivial to defeat. Like, I did all the actual work for that, like really not more than 2 days.
And that is part of what makes Nino's approach to unraveling complex obfuscation, such as that employed by ScatterBrain, awe-inspiring. I'm your host, Josh Stroshine, and you're listening to Behind the Binary. In this episode, Nino Isakovic discusses his essential approach to problem solving, sharing his methodology and toolkit, which he applied to reverse engineering extreme threats like the ScatterBrain obfuscating compiler. Let's dive into the discussion. Okay, joining me today is Nino. Nino has been a longtime reverse engineer, and if you're familiar with his work, you've likely seen that he is out there tackling some of the more challenging problems that we face in the field. Nino, thank you for taking time to join me today. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
I think, maybe we could get started just with a little bit of introductions and background. If you could maybe tell us a little about yourself, what got you into reverse engineering, maybe where your career has taken you.
Sure. So computing in general wasn't kind of my thing initially, as when I was younger, very young. It was just more sports oriented. And at some point I did get into, I did get interested into like programming, engineering, asking the question, like, how does this thing work on a computer? And that actually led me very quickly to reverse engineering, because some of the first code I wrote was C code and C++ code. And then I caught on quickly that, well, the text is not actually what gets executed. In fact, the text itself in the what we call source code is actually a very, very minor player in the reality of the execution and the program behavior and so on and so forth. So for me, it's like, well, what does that look like? And I just kind of started to realize, well, there is something called the ISA, an instruction set architecture. It is kind of like a blueprint, a high-level blueprint for what a computer does. And compiler authors, such as those that produce C or C++ compilers, they use those manuals, those guides, in order to take that text and then generate what's called assembly code, machine code in some sense as well. And then, from that point on, it was me kind of poking about, trying to understand what the reality actually is. And I'm a big believer of breaking abstractions and seeing what actually, what is behind them. I don't believe there's a such thing as zero cost abstraction. There is just costs for any kind of abstraction, and the best way that we can evaluate those costs is by looking at empirically the reality. So in this case, it's seeing the lowest level barrier for us as software folks, which is kind of assembly machine code, creating tooling, creating introspection around that area, and then being able to reason about properly what a program is doing. Whether it was just a regular program, like this was completely unrelated to malware or to exploits, it was just kind of like, well, what does this actually do? How does the computer run it? And fun fact, actually, like that kind of kicked off me quickly writing kernel mode drivers. I started on Linux, which was a disaster, because I realized you can't really debug Linux drivers conveniently, or it's like a mess to do it. And I just kind of transitioned quickly to Windows, because they have WinDBG. They actually designed WinDBG, I found out, as part of NT, like as a cornerstone to have debugging tools integrated with developing the OS, and then services and components on top of the OS, like in user mode and so on. So I quickly gravitated towards Windows, primarily because I could introspect better into the reality of what my program, in this case driver, was doing.
Okay, so you got into reversing early, got into working with the kernel and gravitated towards Windows. When did you get drawn to software that was intentionally obfuscated, malware or exploits, or something that's just trying to protect its intellectual property?
Yes, it kind of was an extension for what I just mentioned, kind of just learning programming, learning computing. Because once I started to get interested in compilers and how they produce native code, I realized scripting languages, they do something similar, but they don't produce native code, they produce interpreters. And interpreters are pretty much what at least a core software protection, especially ones that protect IP, even in gaming as well, is virtual machine protection. And it basically stems from how interpreters for scripting languages are implemented. Not all of them, there's certainly differences, but the core theory kind of starts there. So, what I can kind of TLDR for you is my main interest in everything computing really came from just wanting to know how a machine works. Like with the hardware, like how can we do all this stuff in the software? How can we have sound devices that don't function like they should, occasionally, and so on? What kind of connects all the dots? And so for me, it was always kind of trying to see behind the looking glass and see how stuff is implemented. And that eventually led to realizing that this kind of introspection, I kind of always called it investigative reversing, is really core to security work, security research, malware analysis, vulnerability analysis, and so on. So then I kind of gravitated towards that because that was really what my primary interests were with computers.
Yeah, I mean, it's if you've been a computer user for any time, even to this day, getting ready to do a podcast, there's still all these troubleshooting steps that you have to go and go through to get things to work, to get the audio to work well, and to have and there's no video in this case, but oftentimes with meetings and other things that you're doing. And it seems like understanding the technology is what allows you to really troubleshoot that effectively. Otherwise, you're just unplugging things in, you're just restarting browsers, restarting computers, which is, it sometimes fixes the problem, but not fundamentally. It doesn't get to the core of what is causing the issue to give you a long lasting solution. What is your approach to like the tools you use in reversing and how you tackle all these different areas that are related to dealing with this wide variety of software that you encounter as a security practitioner?
Yeah, my approach is very simple. It's all code. I kind of don't differentiate the difference. Like I would never refer to myself as an exploit developer, a malware researcher, doing malware analyst. To me, they're just problems, and there's just a subset of problems I'm interested in solving. I don't like to put labels. I don't like to put classifications over it because I don't like to generalize prematurely. I think that is a common thing I see just in the software space and generally. There is a tendency, at least I see it this way, there's a tendency that there is a notion to quickly label and classify and categorize things without actually having looked at what, said problem is all about. So for me, it was always breaking abstractions. Like I never believed the notion that there is such thing as zero cost abstraction. There is such thing as don't worry about how something is implemented, treat it as a black box, learn the API, and then just base your reasoning off of that. To me, this is like it's hard for me to articulate how insane this sounds, because if we apply that logic to other fields, like literally what we would say, like I would translate it like this, is that off of faith alone, trust me or the people that I work with and the interface that we built, trust that alone. Don't actually look at what we're really doing and what we're really implementing and how we're doing it. Don't do that, right? That's a no-no. Just look at the user face, look at the interface, and then reason about that for the problems you want to solve. Like that to me was just illogical by definition, because it's purely faith-based. And so for me, like engineering is empirical-based. You need to know how to measure. You need to know how to introspect into how your abstractions are actually designed. And then you're in the best position to actually reason about what problems you want to solve, whether they're development problems, like creating in some kind of particular software. So let's say like X-rays, building the compilers, building disassemblers, or as like us as reverse engineers, security engineers, we want to go inspect in large part compiled binaries and so on. We want to break those abstractions. Like we know, for instance, how C++ implements classes in virtual inheritance, virtual dispatch, and so on and so forth. We know what those look like in implementation. We know what Go routines for Golang look like in implementation, and so on. If we didn't know that, there's no way we could do malware analysis successfully. There's no way Hexrays and Binary Ninja and products like these, companies like these, that they could actually build tooling that can help us solve those problems because we lack the visibility at that level. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, we have, it seems like a lot of what you're kind of describing is that we're just trying to control the complexity of what you're dealing with. And obfuscation is this, I don't know, intentional layer or layers of complexity. And a lot of times it's very superficial, but it can be very daunting and even sometimes intimidating when you go to, say I get a sample and I start doing some initial analysis and I see that it's, just the maybe the graph, the control flow is just really all over the place, or I mean, it can kind of set the stage where I'm I don't know if intimidated is the right word, but artificially stunt my investigation or my willingness to tackle that reversing challenge. Is how, I mean, is it approach you take to dealing with this complexity? Is it the same, just kind of breaking it down into smaller components, focusing on what is the actual issue that you're trying to solve, and just, I don't know, how do you look at those then?
hmm Yeah, definitely. I start with like, what's the actual issue that I'm trying to solve, or ask the age-old engineer question: what actual problem am I trying to solve? So I definitely kind of start with that. But I think when I hear like what you're describing, intimidating, I think is the right term, because how can you not be? We just develop presuppositions, pre-notions of how we understand a particular problem for reversing and malware analysis and so on. It's primarily dictated by the tools that we use. And I think this is a severe limitation, because those tools aren't necessarily designed for the problems that we see. And they're certainly not designed for instance, how we operate at Google, where we're dealing with malware at an incredible scale, where it's not really about one file, it's about millions. So I think the way I approach it, and I've been known to say this a lot, reversing is not an IDA problem. Reversing is not a binary ninja problem. It's not a Ghidra problem. I think the biggest kind of disappointment, if that's the right term, I've seen, especially in malware analysis, is there's a lack of libraries, right? Like decoupled components that together can simulate a kind of binary analysis framework that we can leverage to solve our problems. Like ones you mentioned, where you have a scattered control flow graph and it looks crazy, it looks intimidating, because the tooling that we have to reason about how it's implemented, how it works, what we're trying to get out of it, it's just there. We have the wrong lenses, So of course we're kind of walking blind. So for me, it also begins from asking even more primitive questions, like, well, what is a control flow graph? What constitutes the execution of a program, right? And then you kind of build CFGs on top of that, or data flow graphs, right? Data flow analyses between different data structures, or just something like that. So I feel like defining terms is key to me, to be able to reason about complicated situations, and not just defining them in abstraction or in isolation, like, Gemini something and get a nice answer to a kind of term and kind of go with it. It's like, no, I need to use my own language, my own understanding, for actually understanding the primitives and the components in the problem space that I'm operating in. So, I mean, that's definitely very high level. I didn't give anything practical with it, but I do kind of have that mental model in my head, and then kind of begin from there. So in the case of, let's say, obfuscated control flow graph, I kind of start from the opposite. Well, again, like, what is a control flow graph? How is this generated? What does this look like? What are the limitations for, let's say, in this case, compilers generating a function? Because it usually boils down to an individual function. Like, let's kind of take a step back and ask the question, well, what is binary analysis and all the subsets that come on top of it, right? Malware analysis and so on and so forth. Like, we have binaries and we're doing a kind of analysis on it. Well, what does that actually mean in practice? Like, what does that look like beyond the abstraction? So if we load a binary, let's say some kind of DLL on Windows, and we use IDA to load it, what are the abstractions that we get to work with? So the way IDA works is it classifies everything into functions. We have a functions view, which is a view I actually don't use. We can kind of get into maybe how I use these tools a bit later on. But my point really is like, well, how does the tooling that we rely on to conduct our investigations actually categorize this problem? And then I evaluate whether those primitives are good or bad, depending on the circumstances, and kind of proceed incrementally from there. And usually it just boils down to me having my own libraries, my own code for problems that I encounter often, right? So like I have a lot of code that traverses a one point in a binary to some endpoint. So maybe that starting and endpoint can be the beginning and end of a function, but for obfuscation, it doesn't have to be, all right? It can just be an arbitrary kind of range and so on. So yeah, how I really begin to reason about it is understanding actually what the problem is. Like, what's the issue here? Why am I feeling intimidated? Why am I lacking the clarity? And try to be as reflective about it, right? And not be quickly to rush to Google stuff, search stuff, right? Like, is there a tool for this quickly or something? I'm not a big fan of that, unless you're going to go evaluate that tool and understand what it does, because you will encounter these problems again and again and again, because we deal with sophisticated threat actors, we deal with nation state threat actors, we deal with individuals or groups that have a serious incentive to commit crime and, do nefarious things. So they're invested here. So for me, I myself need to be invested reciprocally and be prepared and be able to understand what the actual problem space for binary analysis looks like. And we can get into that if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I always find to be a challenge is there's this, maybe the difficulty getting past that initial layer of intimidation, of the complexity of what you're dealing with, and kind of breaking it down into those smaller components or those primitives. I think there's also a time constraint issue, and that a lot of times, I know for me, when I'm analyzing something, especially for work, I feel this pressure to get to the end goal as quickly as I can, and to not take the time, not to take any time I feel is unnecessary in really understanding the problem. Like, I'm willing to cut corners. Can I throw this in an LLM and get an answer? Great. I'm going to do it. I'm going to provide an answer. I'm going to move on. That just seems to be, though, ultimately short-sighted and really hurt my growing as a reverse engineer or an engineer, however you want to look at that. How do you feel those same kind of pressures, and do you deal with, how do you deal with kind of balancing that? I don't know how else to look at it, like taking more time to really understand the problem, or trying to rush to a solution because you think maybe there's a business need to get there.
Yeah, I think this raises several questions, and one of them, let's take the business aspect, where you are in a timer, there is a clock, you have expectations to deliver on that clock. So of course, if you can cut corners, I mean, that should be kind of the default. But the thing is, for me, us as professionals, we don't come to the field, so to speak, empty-handed. We don't just wake up with nothing, and then these problems with these deadlines are thrown at us, and like kind of go figure it out. Like, we come prepared. So for me, it's a question really of preparation, because you can prepare in advance for the problems that you deal with and kind of sharpen your sword and really understand your tooling that you're using to reason about these problems. So when you do have stuff that's tricky that you haven't seen before, that's convoluted or whatever, well, your tool package is ready to go, right? So like, you save a lot of time in preparation. So for me, it's kind of, I've had discussions about, because I use primarily, my variant, my in quotes, of C++ for my personal tooling to solve all these problems. And I've been kind of asked, like, well, why don't you use something like Python and so on, because you can pip install, the universe as far as Python is concerned.
Right.
And to me, I understand that, but I'm not coming again to the playing field with nothing. Like, if I am an expert in this domain, well, I would have hopefully thought about how I work, been very reflective about how I solve problems, where I'm lacking, what I need to work on, what I need to focus on. And for me, when I reflect like that, I'm kind of really describing my workspace, my workflow, my environment. And I think it's very important to do that, because then I can specialize to how I approach problems. So maybe I can't pip install everything, but I'm coming ready. I'll have everything kind of prepared to kind of, and if I know in advance I'm working a tight schedule, right? There's deadlines for set problems. Well, to me, it's a question of preparation, right? Like, it's not, again, you just wake up, turn on your laptop, your computer, your desktop, 100 problems are thrown your way. It's like, Maybe initially, maybe you're starting out, you haven't kind of experienced that. So, okay, you got to kind of adjust on the fly. But I think as professionals, uh, preparation is key. You need to know what your problems look like. You need to know how tooling solves those problems, and then create, like recipes or solutions kind of in advance. So once you get these problems, you can already kind of navigate through them flexibly and like see end rows, right? See, where you can cut corners and so on and so forth. And then you can identify also like, oh, well, I didn't have time to investigate this aspect, but I kind of didn't need it to solve my problem. But let me just make a mental note of that. And one technique I use, I mean technique in quotes because it's not a technique, is journaling. Like I will definitely journal, like stream of conscious. I won't try to, get too fancy with getting the grammar right, whatever. Like, what were my thoughts about this problem? How did I solve it? Where did I go astray? Like, where did I just do stupid things? And just like write it out without any structure so it comes freely from me. And I'll evaluate that on my time afterwards, right? So I can at least capture my thinking process as I was solving a problem. So I'm not sure if that answers it. You can let me know. But for me, to summarize it, is you should be prepared. Like, if you know in advance, obfuscators exist. And I mean, for us, we have data. We can go categorize and see what, obfuscations we see. Well, we can prepare for that, right? We can make that a side project. We can do that on our own time. We can do that on company time, right, as part of research and so on and so forth. So for me, it's a question of preparation and understanding your tooling. And being adamant that you create a workflow that's actually realistic to the problems that you're solving. And make sure it's stable. Like, because pip install one day will work for something. They do an update, something happens that you're kind of, oblivious to, that can hinder your workflow, right? Because now you may have to troubleshoot that tool and so on. So yeah, let me know if that answers it.
And it makes me think too, there's something that I imagine a lot of us have experienced over our careers, you don't know what you don't know. And that can be sometimes the biggest, at least for me, it's sometimes the biggest obstacle to overcome is just seeing problems from a different perspective. In this case, seeing potential challenges and knowing kind of what's out there and figuring out ways then to help prepare or as you said, sharpen that sword so that when you get into an environment where you just don't know what's going to come your way, you have the most robust ability to respond as you can. And with that, I think comes confidence and less intimidation. Is there anything in particular that you've experienced that helps in that preparation and kind of knowing where are those areas to look or those corners to peek behind in your preparation?
Absolutely. I would kind of go back to what I was saying earlier about categorizing and classifying binary analysis. Well, what is this thing that we do, right? Like, let's put boundaries around it. So we're not just like looking everywhere, right? Let's create the problem space for the area that we operate under. And if we kind of do that, let's say with binary analysis specifically, we do kind of get to what I was saying in the beginning of like, well, how does the computer work? Like, what is this ISA, this instruction set architecture? Why are there different ones? How can we learn about them? And so on and so forth. And the way I kind of have a mental model is there's a computer, we're dealing with the computer, but that's too high level, right? If we just talk like that, we're not solving any kind of problem. So we kind of peek a little bit further and we start breaking the computer into parts. And we can, let's say, start with the ISA at the bottom. And then on top of that, I would say you have an operating system that kind of manages that ISA and provides services to users. Of course, I'm glossing over stuff because there's stuff between that as well. But, for the sake of mental models, let's kind of say there is something like an operating system on top of the ISA that provides facilities. And then on top of that, you kind of have user applications, like user-specific stuff, like sound technology, like, sound applications, programs like IDA, browsers and so on, ransomware like malware. These are kind of the way I classify them as user stuff on top of what this architecture is that I'm describing. So for me, when I build these layers, it's obvious to me where I need to focus on. If I don't understand how, let's say, the operating system works, I'm going to go investigate that. Like, what is an operating system? What is Windows, like internally? Like, what does that even mean? How can I even begin to introspect into here and see what happens when I go read a file or when I browse a website and so on? So having that not just curiosity, the realization that it's like, this is the problem space. The more I learn about how it works, like these layers, especially bottom up, the more clarity I have as to what my gaps are, where I need to focus on, what malware can, like, for instance, do, in our case, because that's what we're primarily concerned with. It's kind of, again, building a boundary, a realistic boundary, not a hypothetical, imaginary one, based on the reality of the constraints that a machine has. And then just reasoning about what level I'm actually operating at. Like when ransomware runs, it starts off as an executable. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, if you poke a little bit deeper, it's what's called a user mode executable. Well, what the heck is that? And you kind of like incrementally progress into going deeper and deeper into the layers of this problem space. And there you just build out a map, of what's happening, how it's happening. And I kind of approach it from that angle, right? Defining the boundaries of the problem space. And I honestly think it's actually very easy because from what I described, I mean, there's so much literature, there's so much education, there's so much information that you can consume about everything that I just discussed. Maybe not into detail, like the stuff that we see, but enough for you to understand what the boundary space for your problems are. And then once you have that, then we can get very specific to the user, like specific aspects that I'm describing, like malware. Like, well, what is malware? We can begin classifying behaviors of malware. Like, what makes a program malicious? And begin asking that question. It's a serious question because a lot of what an admin can do on a computer can be considered malicious. Well, why isn't it? What's the distinction? How do we draw it? And so on. So it's kind of just asking the right questions under the problem space in which you're operating and just proceeding from there, And to me, it kind of starts exactly with that because that's the reality. At the end of the day, it's a real machine. It really works, sometimes, and a certain way. And we just need to understand how that is. And note, most of that is not specific to knowing how, techniques such as process injection, are, or what's an exploit, what does that actually look like in reality, and so on and so forth. Because to me, once you have your base and your foundation, those things are kind of, you can discover them on your own, right? If you just kind of ask the right questions as you're poking about, you'll get to the understanding of like the reality of a computer. It's just the ISA and it's just code executing. That's it. And everything on top of that is abstractions or qualifications that we impose. So they're like ideas. They're not technically real in a sense, right? Because it's just code executing. Like what is a control flow graph again? Like it's something we stipulate up front, right? Because if you look at, like, for instance, literature about specifically CFG and how you can write your own algorithms, they'll mention, the problem space of that and like what words and terms you need to know. Like a basic block is something that has a one input and one output, and you have that mental model and you can kind of make sense about, putting basic blocks together. You have edges and so on. And we kind of tread towards graph theory and whatnot, but that's all cool, but I know how to introspect into abstractions. So when I go look at, like, for instance, how a CFG for a function looks like, I kind of see things that is not being stipulated from what I just described. Like a basic block doesn't have to be something that has a single input and, one or two outputs. In fact, you can have one basic block going into the middle of another basic block and stuff like that. And once you understand the ISA, that is just one instruction after another, like the ISA doesn't have a concept of a basic block. It just gives you the concept of an instruction, an individual instruction. And if we could poke through that and look at the microcode implementation, let's say for Intel or Apple, ARM, whatever, we'd see it's another function, right? Or something similar, right? It's actually deep logic and so on and so forth. So for me, it's really honing in and being explicit about what is the reality of my problem space and not being lost in rhetoric, not being lost in abstraction, being able to concretely measure, what it is that I'm operating on. And I think it's easy with computers, honestly.
I had an interesting challenge, just happenstance. A couple nights ago, I was trying to get Gemini to help me work on a C program to do a backdoor, basically, for some educational stuff. And it refused. It said that this is used for, this looks like you're using it for malicious purposes. And I said, well, wait a minute. I guess, yeah, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I'm really just using it for educational purposes. And I tried messing with the prompting to get around it, but it eventually gave up and went somewhere else. But it was interesting because I really had to think through, and that was part of my justification at one point in time. I said, well, yes, in some context it's used for malicious purposes. In other contexts, though, I said it's essentially the technology you're using to interact with me, and it's all such a it's such an interesting exercise of that classification and the capabilities of intent behind the software. And as you mentioned, at the lowest level, the computer has no real understanding of what its even purpose probably is. It's just executing instructions at a time for us.
That's right.
So, maybe shifting gears a little bit here, just in talking about solving tough problems. And I found, for me, reverse engineering has been, and oftentimes is, sort of a solo endeavor. I feel I've done a lot of my core learning on my own, using resources that are available across the web, and then just some toil of struggling with code, doing research, looking at manuals. I find that when I'm reversing, it's oftentimes very much a solo endeavor. How do you see reversing as a team sport? Right? What role does your colleagues, your peers, working on a team? I mean, we're at one of the largest RE teams probably in the world at Flare. How does that change how you can go about as a reverse engineer, and not only tackling these tough problems, but maybe how you approach your career and your own professional development?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I don't have a definitive answer. I can just give my experience. I think it's fantastic to be part of a team where you and I can just jump on a call. I can share my screen and say, hey, Josh, I'm working on this. What are your thoughts? You give me yours. We can just bounce ideas off of each other. We can solve problems together very quickly, right? We're in remote, like different parts of the world, but just hop on a call and we can kind of collaborate together. But I think a lot of that is still very ad hoc. I think you can do that with anything, right? That's not specific to reversing or engineering, right? You can do that with anything. So how do we get specific to collaborative reversing, collaborative RE, collaborative malware analysis? And I think, again, this goes back to tooling, because the reality is there's just an extremely limited commercial availability of tooling, of products for the work that we do. And none of it solves this problem. It's a difficult problem in some sense. So I think that would be my initial answer, is we just lack the tooling currently. Maybe we could build our own and so on and so forth. But commercially, the tooling to collaboratively work on reverse engineering problems doesn't really exist. And when I think about it, it's because I don't think, again, trying to be explicit in defining terms, I think once I try to define collaborative reversing, I don't have something concrete. I'd be curious to hear if you have anything, or what your thoughts on a definition for collaborative reversing looks like, because I think that could provide clarity into how we, can utilize something or build tooling like something like that. Like, should we have a kind of a Git model, right, where we can push, merge, pull, and so on and so forth? I don't think so. I actually don't think this is the right model for reversing. But even so, let's take that. What would that look like? Like, one, we have to implement it. I mean, IDA teams exists, and I don't think it solves that problem. And I'm not sure what Binary Ninja has or what others products that do it have. But I think it's a challenging problem, really, because there's no clear definition on what you're trying to solve. And once you're in that kind of state, well, flip a coin with what's going on. So for me, realizing that, it's really, I think communication is unbelievably underrated in our space, because we have so many introverts. We have so many, what's the term? Asocial. I don't know. I mean, I say this positively, not negatively. And I get it. Like, if someone tells me, hey, just leave me alone, I'll put on my headset, I'll blast my music, we'll go in my corner and just, I'm going to excel at what I do, and I'm very productive, I will not interfere with that, So for me, I think, though, communicating like you and I are doing now, like you've been doing with this podcast, or just in general, like as we solve problems as a team, is critical, right? I need to know what you're thinking. You need to know what I'm thinking. We need to share what we're working on, so we all are kind of tuned in. We're all part of the team, right? We're not just individual elements that are classified as a team, but really, if you look at the reality, is each one is doing what they want on their time, kind of thing, and it's very disconnected and so on. So for me, it's trying to be very communicative, active, reaching out to people and say, hey, I'm just working on this. You're interested? Let me share my screen and let's just talk about it, work about it. Let me show you. If it's some interesting stuff like, hey, I just deobfuscated this virtual machines. You want to see how I did it? And just kind of engage in discussion. Not really much to, to show any, not to appeal to my ego kind of thing, just to share information, right? Just to show you, hey, this is how I think about problems. This is how I do. And I love it when people reach out to me and they share stuff, right? And they may even say, oh, it's very simple. This is all nonsense. I don't like to judge simple, medium, complicated. Again, they're just problems. And either we're interested in solving them or we're not. And if we're interested, I think, these labels of, beginner, medium, this is all nonsense. This just deters you, right? It's like, well, I'm beginner. I kind of know. It's problems. Of course you can contribute to them, especially if you're involved, right? With somebody who is more experienced, who does have that experience. But again, experience doesn't necessarily mean a hierarchical structure where my, intelligence is superior to yours in this problem. It's just like I've been engaged in this problem space for a bit longer. So I have some data I can share, and so I kind of try to realize again what the actual problem is with collaborative reversing and realizing that tooling currently is just not in the state to solve that. So trying to address it at a human level, right? Realizing like where people that actually do this, well, let's talk to each other, right? And if you are a certain way, like you're very introverted, I will do the adjustment, right? Like I'll adjust to that because I'd also like to be introverted and just, left alone. But if I need to be talkative and if I need to lead a discussion or engage individuals like this, I'll more than happily do it because I think that at least kind of creates some kind of collaboration, right, within the team and so on. And eventually maybe we can get tooling here to to pick up and help us out. But again, I think it's important to state what is the definition of collaborative reversing? Like what actual problem are we trying to solve when we stipulate that? Because if you don't do that, I mean, from an engineering perspective, you just won't get anywhere, right? You don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, I have before I got into, I guess, cyber security and reverse engineering in particular, I was more of I kind of like the term forward engineer, kind of a cheeky way of saying it. I initially I hear that or I bring that up and I think, okay, yeah, we need to have Git and we need to have some code versioning. And, I haven't used Teams and IDA. It sounds like it's similar. I know Ghidra's got basically an SVN thing on top of the database so that you can share it with others. And that's really cool. But I don't think that really even addresses the issue. One thing that always comes up, and when I think about this, example, I work on a team of incredibly talented people, and I feel a lot of times isolated. What am I missing? And I think some of it is just what you were just talking about. It's the knowledge sharing. It's how do I grow my, in my profession with my skills and my understanding of the different problem areas that I'm interested in, based off of the experience that everybody else is gathered and gaining and sharing on from their own work. And how do I kind of tap into that? And we can't obviously have somebody give a presentation every time they finish analyzing a piece of malware, but that would be, to me, I think the piece that I'm the most interested in. And does that make it team reversing? Maybe not so much, but there is an element of knowledge sharing and communication that I'd really like to tap into that I know I personally feel like I'm just kind of missing out on. So, but it's a tough problem to solve, as we've discussed. I mean, it takes a lot of effort. I've been in the educational space for a long time now, and it takes a lot of effort to put together and share content. I don't know if that's a good enough barrier, but it's certainly, I think it inhibits folks oftentimes because they maybe artificially see, well, I can't just share a little tidbit here or there, or maybe it's not worth sharing, or maybe the commitment to create, it's got to be a blog post or an educational unit like a course. And that's just too great and too big of a time commitment. I'm not really sure what it all is.
No, I think it raises a great point, and I'm curious, in your experience, especially mentioning you do have a big educational background, because one in quotes solution or I think one initiative that could be done is maybe not presenting right every analysis that you do because that's probably infeasible, but categorizing it, cataloging it, structuring it somewhere centralized that we can all access to, so that you can go when you do have interest in something, it's readily accessible to you, not just as a quick summary, but the actual details of what it took to understand that particular malware, what was relevant about it, what was the bigger context around it, because I think people tend to forget malware is cyber weapons. Like, this is serious stuff. Like, it's not just, oh, this stupid thing does some kind of thing I've seen 10,000 times and I'm kind of on with my day. Sure, maybe, in the implementation of the technical aspects of this program, that's what it is. But in the context of reality, like, someone is using this to attack an organization or an individual. So it's like, can't be understated that these are cyber weapons, with intention usually to do serious harm or just to commit harm, and so on. So for me, I think it's very important to catalog, all of that. Like I mentioned, I journal a lot, as I'm like, not in my personal life. I suck there, so I don't do any journaling there. But I'm journaling because I oftentimes also, my entropy, like with problems I'm facing, is so scattered. It's so varied, right? I kind of been dubbed here the garbage man, just get everybody's garbage. So for me, I need, just for my own mental sanity, to have structure in this kind of chaotic environment. And so for me, at minimum, if I'm invested in a problem, even say for like 30, 40 minutes, let me at least define explicitly what I did, how I did, what I need to do, and where I will go once I can pick that up, and kind of try to scale that. But kind of getting to your point about information sharing and so on, I think we need to centralize this. We need to have something like a Kanban board, or something like Obsidian, like not exactly Obsidian, but some kind of technology that actually tries to answer those questions, and we just leverage them with malware stuff that we do, and binary analysis as well, and just kind of centralize. We need to centralize information and make it readily accessible. Like that would be, to me, like kind of be again an initiative, a potential solution that we can solve at a more like human level, right? Like, we're not implementing a tool. We're just sharing information, and we're going to catalog it with existing tools. Simple as that. And I think even it being that simple, it can be very powerful. I mean, just think about it. If you are dealing with something like VM Protect, for instance, or some commercial packer, and then you have knowledge ready, available, and accessible to you in order to be able to reason about how to deal with it, especially in the time frame that we discussed with deadlines that we have to meet and so on. I mean, it's invaluable. And it costs me nothing really to kind of add that information and make it presentable for an audience that will consume it. Like, the cost for somebody who's knowledgeable in that domain to go do that is almost nothing, right? So it's just, especially with tooling now, like with Gemini and large language models, I mean, 98% of the work is done for you, right? So it's, to me, I think that could be, again, one avenue. But again, this would also generalize, right? So I think you could apply that. Again, I'm curious to hear if you're willing to share, like, what that looked like from your experience in education, like formal education, and was there something like that? Like, how did students consume information that you were teaching them and presenting them outside of the classroom? Were there discussion groups after? Were there like online chat rooms or like Discords or whatever that students can, like, what did that look like, if you wouldn't mind sharing?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's actually a couple things that this just you sparked a memory, and it's kind of an ironic one, because when I first got into getting into reverse engineering, it was while I was teaching and going through an academic program. And one of the things that I found really valuable, I set up a WordPress site locally, and anytime I touched a piece of malware, I did any sort of reversing or analysis on it, I would document it, I would categorize it, and I would tag it with relevant things, anti-disassembly, anti-whatever, maldoc. And then that way, 6 months down the road, when I'm like, I remember I did some sort of analysis here, I don't really want to have to take the time to relearn what I did. I could go back to my journal entry, my WordPress blog. And it's kind of interesting. I've lost that over the years. And it was not like these were all blog worthy facing the public. They were just rough notes capturing the essential elements of the analysis that I did at the time. And then I encouraged my students to do that. I said, build yourself this repository of learning, of your learning, of things that you've uncovered that you think are worth recollecting. And that will just build over time, and it hopefully provides you with the resources you need to become, really effective in this. And then I guess, like all maybe good advice, you don't adhere to it yourself. So I've kind of gotten away from that. Outside of that, a lot of the students, I've taught a lot of online classes. And so the learning, I think that's another one of those areas where we've embraced in formal academic settings, online or virtual learning, but we just tried to take an old model, the on campus, and shove it into the virtual world and not really look at it as a whole new problem with different tools and different approaches. And so I've been kind of frustrated with it over the years. I for students, some of them would just live in isolation. You knew that they were out there and that they were a part of a course, but it was hard to facilitate asynchronous interaction. Some of them would take it upon themselves to create study groups. Sometimes I would try to prompt them. I was always careful to not be too heavy-handed, though, and force people to get together. Discords is pretty popular, getting everybody into Discord and just chat and help each other out. Sometimes the software, the course education management software, would help facilitate that again. But I guess I've also had this perception of things just from the way that I grew up, and that you can just figure it out on your own. And I've had to really battle with that over the years, because a lot of times that can be an unhealthy approach to a lot of aspects of life, not just reverse engineering. So I don't know. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it's just a lot of different ways. I don't know if there's one single uniform way that I've seen students embrace the challenges of a course that I can say. It's just very subjective to the group and their dynamics and who has what experience. And I've got classes I'm actually teaching again this fall. I've got a class that's undergraduate and doctoral students. I'm like, what a disparate group of people to have in a classroom right now learning reverse engineering. It's a strange problem.
Yeah, definitely. And very interesting. I mean, just for the variety that you kind of just articulated, it's I think education is incredibly important. Again, speaking of centralizing and sharing information for our work, I think, right, an extension of that in society is having such institutions for everybody, for the benefit of so I think it's a serious problem. And one I'm also particularly interested in, because I mean, what does it mean to learn something? It's just, to me, a very fascinating question, and so much you can dig into from that perspective. But to kind of keep it more on in our space, I think the best we can really do is, until we learn how we can make tooling that can accommodate that explicitly, is just share as much as possible, even if it's ad hoc. If the minimum that you can do is just hop on a call and have a discussion and share some information, you don't want to write anything up, you don't want to record videos, well, you know what? That's better than nothing. Because I think there's a lot of people doing a lot of interesting work, and it's not really being shared. Like, I'll give you one example, since I know Windows internals very well. I know, I literally have like a mental model of it in my head that I could just like close my eyes and maneuver through it. And and I bring it up specifically because if you check research like into Windows internals this decade, it's incredibly sparse and almost exclusively limited to certain people. If you go back a decade, specifically with a guy like, Alex Ionescu and so on, like, I mean, it was so much content, just in that case, even coming from one individual, but also elsewhere. Like, you can find just weird blogs, you can find stuff on, back when it was called Twitter and so on, and, Reddit, like just, some individual had some idea in their head, they pursued it, and they shared that content. Maybe it wasn't always shared very well, but there was a plethora of information about, like, for instance, when Windows 10 came and they changed their architecture within the kernel, they introduced this concept of the secure kernel and VBS virtualization-based security, and like, what the heck is all that? So much stuff to consume. And if you go from like 2020 onwards, I struggle to find anything meaningful, right? I mean, I'm kind of, exaggerating the point. There definitely is spots where people have done some incredible research, but I feel like the decline is kind of adamant. It's kind of obvious. You can see it if you look. And I think it's a shame. Like, Windows has certainly evolved, especially in our domain as it pertains to security, that I think it's a shame that we aren't getting the actual nitty-gritty, the technical insights by professionals, with what it looks like, as opposed to, us having to do that individually, isolated, and so on. So
this is actually maybe a theme that's come up across the podcast and different guests, is this we need to return to more written technical content, more whatever it is, social media posts, blogging, short of maybe full textbooks, but that there's just been this marked decline in it, and you seem to be echoing that same thing. Do you think there's any particular reason that we're seeing less written content, especially now with LLMs? You'd think it'd be easier than ever to help craft, gain the, because that's how I find using them to be the most beneficial for me, is I prompt it with all the technical stuff I need, and then it just helps me polish it up a bit.
Yeah, no, you raise a great point, and maybe it will. Maybe now I think people are just really relying maybe too much on LLMs for stuff like that. So maybe we will see that for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. But my opinion, at least if I were to speculate on like the decline of it, is I think the medium of text is, again, in my opinion, horrible. Like, imagine if I give you 1,000 pages of just text and I say, Josh, you're capable, you know how to read, you know how to you know how to make mental models and make connections in the text. Kind of go to town, have fun, and tell me what this is all about. It's like you know in advance what you need to do in order to extract from that medium what's relevant, what's benefit. You can kind of go do all of that. But in order for you to do it, it's incredibly tedious. Try to do Control F on a physical book. Forget about it. It's not going to happen. So for me, I think technology is in a state where we need, just as a society, to understand how we should communicate information, and whether like a text-based medium is really something that we should like prioritize, and kind of like, why aren't we seeing more books and so on, especially like physical books. And I think honestly that would be a regression, because to me it's just data. It's just some useful data that we make, like some kind of information that we think is important, and of course we want to capture it. But the capturing aspect is just related to how we want to define a medium. Because if we really, like books, like, just with print, then why don't we just go back to clay tablets from like 5,000 years ago, right? Like, why aren't we, it's kind of like, I don't want to go on this note, but, you'll have parents like worried about screen time and like, hey, don't play that Nintendo Switch 2, DK Bonanza, it's not good for you, and so on. And of course, I understand like where they're coming from. But in some sense, it's also kind of denying the technological innovations that we have made as a society, that we can have a device like a Nintendo Switch and create just unbelievably rich content for kids to consume, right, and benefit from and improve from, and so on. Of course, there are negatives with that as well. But my point being is, going back to the tech space, I think we've just advanced technologically to the point where we can ask meaningful questions about, well, how should we, transmit data that we think is important. Like when I write, even my own notes, I color everything. Like I'd rather open up like my notebook or like my Obsidian here or whatever, and just see a bunch of color rather than just raw black and white text. Just to be able to reason about, what something is and so on. I kind of love, like I see, like I guess it's rappers or some musicians, they'll release like these, I don't know the name, maybe you know it, where they'll like release their song, and then they like color the syllables, they'll color the enunciations, they'll kind of capture, and it's just like, this is excellent. Like this is a way to transmit this information, at a textual level that is very engaging. You can like quickly discern what's important, what's not, as opposed to imagine you just have raw black and white text. Like you can do it, we can do it. We have the skill set, but we're imposing on ourselves tedium that I think is unnecessary. So I think we need to explore more about not just sharing information. It's like, what is the best way? What's the best medium? Like say you write a physical book, especially a technical one. I mean, technical topics change so rapidly. There's always stuff you can add on. Like, what's the point of writing even a book a year ago, a physical one, where, if you have to make updates, well, how do you do it? You got to restart the publishing, like, like imagine just have a website and you just, push update and kind of get on with your life and so on. So, again, not to knock physical books or like physical mediums with text. I just think, again, to the question, like, why has there been a decline? Maybe not for these exact reasons I just articulated, but I do think that at least society is cognizant that there has been technological innovation, and I don't think we're I mean, it's so easy to just think you will have access to anything, right? I can just open my phone, hop on Reddit, hop on, Mastodon, Twitter, X, whatever, and just be filled with information, right? And then there's many stuff like that. So I think we take that for granted because that can easily go away, and then it's not as accessible. So yeah, it's an interesting question, but I think it's a societal one where I think society needs to adapt to the technological advances that we have had, and I don't think it has, especially in education. To me, it's like, for instance, if you have a daughter, a son, and they go to school and they're learning how to write, and they don't write very neatly and very clearly, is this an actual problem that we should be concerned about? I don't think so. Just type it. Like, who cares anyway? Like, it's really not a thing to kind of emphasize or prioritize. But I don't want to undermine. Like, it's a serious problem. It takes serious thought and investment to go articulate what actually here needs to be addressed. What are the best ways to address it, and so on. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting question and interesting problem.
All right, so we've been talking a lot about just reversing tough problems and sort of big picture concepts, and so a lot of the challenges that we face both in the field and then things that are kind of universal problems. Maybe let's shift into something a little more tangible. You did some incredible work earlier this year on what's being called ScatterBrain, which is a compiler that introduces a lot of difficulties in analyzing the resulting binaries. Can you maybe take us through just a little bit of what ScatterBrain is and maybe what drew your attention to these samples in the first place?
So Scatterbrain is a name that we gave, just kind of made sense given how the obfuscation was implemented. But what actually is this Scatterbrain? It's an obfuscating compiler, so something like LLVM. So LLVM, as in what Clang, the compiler, is based off. It's an infrastructure for compiler technology, basically designed in the early 2000s, and they have, or somebody kind of forked that and created an obfuscated LLVM. That's what the O stands for. And what it allows you to do is create obfuscated binaries through a natural compilation process. And what that looks like is that you have your code. You just write your code however you want to, like plain, let's say C++ or C or something else, depending on your obfuscating compiler. And then the compiler will do the rest for you, for the most part. And what does that actually look like? So as the compiler is transforming your code into a binary, it can add passes that will, let's say, de-optimize the output. So instead of like identifying a hot loop in your code and it's trying to optimize it as much as it can, it's going to kind of do the inverse. A lot of de-obfuscation can be categorized, at least at the binary level, as de-obfuscation, where they try to make inefficient sequences and instructions and so on to hinder analysis and to break tooling and so on. So this is done through what's called in LLVM speak passes. So you write a kind of pass, which is some kind of logic that says, hey, take each block and like randomize it around, but make sure it's semantically accurate and so on and so forth. So all this is kind of done beyond you just writing your code in your source code of choice. So in this case, like C++ and so on. So Scatterbrain is a variant of that. It may very well be based on LLVM, right? That's and I also say that as well because I wish I had their exact names and the exact company, but you can find it easily. Recon, like this year, the huge RE conference, there were some excellent guys that basically read that blog, read the obfuscation library that we published, and were literally, like, I confirmed it for them because they asked me to before their presentation. They literally, like, verbatim, like, implemented the actual obfuscator and generated the identical binaries that we kind of saw. It's an incredibly impressive achievement and so on. Again, one of the benefits of sharing this kind of information, because it provides, especially in the detail, like one of the reasons I made that blog as lengthy as I did, it was to quote another member on our team from what he told me. It's like I kind of fit an educational course into a blog, right? And that was, maybe I didn't think that exactly, but that definitely was kind of the aim, because the content on de-obfuscation is also speaking of stuff that's really not existent. That's one of them. And it's the cases where they do exist, it's extremely academic. You can certainly find white papers from research institutes and universities on deobfuscation tactics and mechanics and so on and so forth. My personal opinion, just being a practical person, having to do this with consequence, like if we don't do this, well, there's a repercussion. It's all like a lot of it is nonsense, and that may be a hot take, but I will stand by it because I have read a lot of these research papers. I'm very interested in obfuscation, primarily because it breaks conventional tooling. So for me, that also means it breaks conventional thinking on how we think about reverse engineering problems. So of course, I'm interested in that. So for me, when I go through these white papers and I kind of see the case studies that they do, it's in some cases it's laughable. I can name names. I won't do that out of respect. And another unfortunate caveat is that they don't share the code, right? Like say you wanted to learn about how to deobfuscate ScatterBrain, and I write up a lengthy blog. I put fancy pictures and diagrams and so on and so forth. While they may have the appearance of being substantive and substantial, like beneficial, and you're eagerly consuming it, trying to learn because you're interested in this topic, but I don't give you the code to go explore it. Like I wouldn't even say this disingenuous doesn't do it to me. Like it's almost useless. What's the point? Like you said this, kudos. Now show me how you actually did it. Because if you can't show me, you probably didn't do it like you said you did. And I think you tend to find that a lot in research in our space, unfortunately, for whatever reasons. It just may be difficult, to share this kind of information. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I've done regarding the obfuscation work, some which I, to take real pride in, I can't even share. I can't discuss it, right? So there is that aspect of it where it's, we're limited in the information that we can share, at least in detail. But yeah, ScatterBrain, again, is an obfuscating compiler in the likes of OLVM, or perhaps it is even a variant of that generates, at least from what we uncovered, 3 different like protections, so to speak. And what I mean by that is, for instance, they can fully protect a binary. And what that means in implementation is every function, like let's say you open a binary in IDA, every single function in there is going to be protected in a very nasty way, right? That it won't let you reason about. Like it's going to break IDA without question, but be Ninja, Deidra, anything. That's kind of the whole point. It's no knock on those tools. They do that, but they can also just limit it to a single function where you have full visibility into 95% of the function, but this one function that they're interested in, they'll just kind of protect that. And then they also have what I remember when I initially was investigating this, I thought it was shellcode, because there was just raw code. But it turned out what I was looking at was the after effects of removing and stripping a P header and some other data that actually constituted a file, and packaging that up in an obfuscated way that was, very difficult to initially reason about. And how I got interested in this, being the garbage man that I am, they just sent it to me and said, hey, go figure it out. So
I see. Okay. Well, yeah, that would make sense when you have that reputation that these perplexities just naturally gravitate towards you. Yeah, and it's really interesting because there is there's a couple blogs out there. I'll make sure to add them to the show notes. And one that probably rivals in length, at least. I've gone through a little bit of it. I don't know about how I could implement their work, but it really discusses in detail the implementation of the compiler that you described in your research as well. So I think that's kind of high kudos to the level of detail that was produced. I mean, when you blogs don't typically go through the same. Well, I shouldn't say that. They don't have to go through the same level of scrutiny that papers in academia do. That's not to say that academic papers are of higher quality. I looked at a lot of stuff that wasn't that great, but reproducibility is always a big part of, or should be a big part of that, that academic formula. And so it's good to see when it's applied to the commercial blogs as well, because I think that's a big part of it. If you're blogging your technical content, you're likely one of your main motivations, hopefully, is to share that knowledge, that education. And if I can't reproduce what you're doing, like you said, it's very frustrating and difficult, and might almost be counterproductive then to ultimately what the goal is. Of course, if it's just clicks, then that's another story.
Yeah, there's always agendas and other aspects. And I mean, huge kudos to Google for publishing such a blog, right? They could have easily not. I think I was told it's the lengthiest blog, at least in Mandiant, Google Mandiant history. I'm not sure if it's still true today. At least it was back in earlier this year. So, but again, it was conscious, it was deliberate, and it was trying to really dispel that. Even like I said, they look nasty, they look so on, and in reality, they're actually very trivial to defeat. Like I did all the actual work for that, in, like really not more than 2 days, like 2 working days. But again, going back to what we discussed in the beginning, being prepared. Like I was able to quickly discern what this is, like what it's doing, and how I can begin to kind of untangle it. Now, of course, you take steps that were mistakes, or like you thought about something incorrectly. But again, you come prepared. Your short is sharpened. You have your toolkit. You can reason about these problems in a very efficient manner that is, time constrained. And again, once you do break it down, so not just to say it. I mean, if you kind of go through the blog, while it has the appearance of just being discombobulated, it's actually very simple once you understand it. So like, what is it actually? What is the core? What is this, like, again, the scatterbrain, where the name kind of comes from? What they did when they produced these kind of obfuscated binaries is they scatter the control flow. So normally control flow, at least how we think of it, even though it's not exactly true in implementation, like in how the hardware does it, is sequentially and linearly. Like there's a push RAX, there's a move RAX, some constant, and there's like a linear sequence of instruction, and we kind of reason about that. So what they do here is they take either a single instruction or like a sequence of instructions, sometimes even a basic block, and they'll move it all around memory, and then they'll connect it a certain way. And the way they connect it is through what I call dispatchers, because it's effectively dispatching from point A to point B, and point B is usually somewhere else in memory, and so on. So like this is kind of the core of what the protection is, and this is unbelievably prominent in different forms in obfuscations we see from malware, which is also why I wanted to release this blog, to kind of showcase, hey, like once you understand this approach and how to tackle it, you can generalize this a lot, because you will see this a lot. So that was also like one of the main reasons for it. And again, kind of like to my point before, that a lot of binary obfuscation is de-optimization. If you think in terms of an optimizing compiler, like this is atrocious. Like like one of the main barriers for performance today is memory access. So how data is accessed in memory. If you compare the speed that it takes to do that compared to how an ALU operates, I mean, it's not even comparable. Like it's night and day. Memory access incredibly slow. CPU, operations incredibly fast, even if you have huge instruction count. And I bring that up because if you think about going from one location in memory to some other scattered another place, this is horrible for cache optimizations, where optimizing compilers try to align data structures and make them local, like so it's kind of very sequential. So when the prefetcher or something, right, gets that data, it just grabs everything next to it, because this will execute next and so on. Kind of giving a high level description, but my point really is that uh, a lot of these obfuscations can be literally viewed and classified as de-optimizations. Like you'll have constant folding. This is a term in compiler optimization speak, and here we can say constant unfolding. Peephole optimization, peephole de-optimization, loop unrolling, loop rolling, and kind of thing. It definitely is a good way to classify a lot of these.
Yeah, code flattening, right?
Code
Is
flattening,
that
yeah.
a kind of a, I don't know, popular term for it?
Yeah.
Disrupting taking the more, kind of abusing that more sequential nature of execution, and just redistributing it, reorchestrating it in a way. And yes, I think that seems to be one of the more prevalent techniques that you do encounter. And you talk about an intimidation layer. It certainly can present that in a lot of binaries that you first encounter if you don't know what you're looking at. And so very interesting, a very great blog. Again, I'll make sure to add it to the show notes, and anyone who's listening is definitely encouraged to go check it out and read more about ScatterBrain. Some other sophisticated threat actor techniques that I know you've been involved with is ORB and ORB Weaver, and Mandiant's published that about that. Can you maybe shed a little light into maybe what ORB Weaver is and what makes it so unique and what your involvement was?
I'll try as best as I can here to to speak. So, what is Orb Weaver? I think there's other term public names like Red Relay Networks or some other ones. But yeah, Orb Weaver is the one we've come out with publicly. And what it really is a massive C2 infrastructure for almost exclusively Chinese threat actors, from nation state to APTs to mercenaries and so on. It is a huge infrastructure, extremely obfuscated. Primarily, as far as what we've uncovered, like IoT devices. That is it's compromised of compromised IoT devices, and they kind of form a peer-to-peer network that scatters all over the world, everywhere, and it is this network that is one of the main infrastructures used for not just targeted attacks, but kind of any kind of attacks. So that's really kind of like the high level core of what Orb Reaver is. And my involvement in it, again, given, like I said, it's extremely obfuscated. They have obfuscated protocols that they speak. They update this. The code is on multiple architectures, from MIPS to ARM, to x86, and so on. Spark, I've seen some, and so on. So it's very diverse. It's very varied, and the complexity also is in getting this data and being able to reason about it. What is it doing? How are they doing? So especially for teams within Google or elsewhere, in Microsoft and anywhere they do kind of threat intel, you try to do attribution, right? Not everybody. I mean, attribution is also notoriously difficult. And this is one of the reasons, because attackers can create such a kind of masqueraded, camouflaged environment that even if you know it exists and you know it's coming from it, unless you really know how to penetrate it, you're speculating, right? For the most part. There's other ways you can probably get telemetry and kind of pinpoint attribution. But so this is why something like this is probably desired from a threat actor perspective, especially, again, if it's IoT devices. It's kind of like almost anything is pawnable. Anything is able to be compromised. So it does have a very kind of scary outlook and so on. So my direct involvement was with basically breaking core parts of this obfuscation, seeing how the protocols speaking those protocols, dissecting them and understanding like how we can gain insight into this network. And I guess I can say like the obfuscations I saw were a lot of control flow flattening. Who they were also probably using and are using a variant of OLVM just because it's convenient, right? Just to leverage it and so on. And the fun part here from an analyst perspective is, while, again, if you read the theory in academia, well, it's not big difference, in the obfuscation if it's on different architectures, if it's done at the source code level. Like I mentioned earlier, you'll have source code and LLVM, you'll, write your source code however you want, you'll deploy to multiple platforms, and the compiler takes the heavy lifting of distributing the executables for those platforms. But then, like, once you, again, try to deobfuscate these, it's extremely specific, right? Like, there's stuff that I see on ARM32 that doesn't exist on x86 or MIPS, and there's stuff on MIPS that I see, even though the code in the source code may have been identical, the actual implementation details in each platform and how they're obfuscated vastly differ. So much so, I could never write a generic deobfuscator for all of this. I did a lot of research into this. Almost in every case, my deobfuscation had to be specific, right, to that case. And that speaks also a lot, because you'll hear claims and so on. Like I know some personally that, like, well, I can deobfuscate all of VM because no, you can't. You can't predict what you don't know. It's just that simple. And there's just stuff that you don't know until you see the implementation of it. So yeah, that's kind of what Orb Weaver is. That was my work into it. And yeah, again, don't think I can share much more, unfortunately.
All right. So, it sounds like we're talking about, problems that are they're different kind of contexts and different use cases, maybe network and compromised devices, but then we still have code running. And so there's a lot of overlap in the type of problems that we're dealing with, the type of obfuscation that we're dealing with. We've talked a lot about tooling so far. Is there what do you see as maybe ways in which tooling could better help? And maybe it is just custom tooling. I know you've mentioned that now as a big part of your toolkit. Or other technologies. It seems like we have time travel debugging, which is certainly not a perfect solution, but it's one of those technologies that has changed the way I look at reversing. You get an execution trace. I mean, at least with debugging, because you get an execution trace of a program, and I don't have to go through and investigate everything. I don't have to set breakpoints and take execution of the program to that point to look around. I can now take the trace and ask questions to the trace about what happened during execution, what memory was accessed, what were the allocations, when was this data read or written to, and so it's sort of definitely changed the way I approach debugging. So so what kind of tools help you with that, or are tools like TTD becoming a larger, or have they been a large part of your approach to these problems?
Oh, they absolutely have. And I think it is, like, I love what you just said, because what I took you to say, I mean, you mentioned it in the context of debugging. I would extend it again in the context of program analysis, binary analysis, that we're treating, let's say, reversing as data analysis, where we run structured queries on structured data in order to gain information and insight. And the way we really progress in our analysis is joining data, making connections between certain data, merging them, and so on and so forth. So we're basically acting as a data analyst, where we have this database. So in the context of time travel debugging, as Microsoft has implemented it, you have a database of the execution state of a user mode process, and you're able to query it. You're able to not just query it, but also, I don't want to say visualize it, but you're able to explore the execution in a very, very powerful manner. And I think there needs to be more innovations for tooling such as this. Like, for instance, I know some game companies, when they make game engines, they create, incredibly sophisticated pieces of software. They make time travel game engines, right? So they can reason about the complexity of the state of the engine when there's something wrong with it, when they need to investigate it, and so on, as part of their development process. So I think it is an extremely powerful tool that has been around for quite a while, actually. And there's other variants. There was a company, I think they got acquired by eShard, called Tetrain, and their product was Raven, Reven, which did the same thing, but did it at an entire operating system level. So you can go capture the execution of Windows itself, and which means any processes on top of it. And I actually had a demo to this while I was employed at Microsoft, where we explored this technology. Another individual and myself, who I don't want to name here, but speaking of this guy, he came from a team in Microsoft that kind of or that organization created time travel debugging, TTD. And what they call it, or these particular engineers, I love this name. I'm curious to see what you think about it. They're called escalation engineers. And they're literally the front line for dealing with any kind of crash, any kind of customer failure of a product, which includes Windows itself, so blue screens and so on and so forth. They get sent to this team for them to troubleshoot, to investigate, well, what happened? Why did this crash happen? And then it'll relay that information to a developer who will go fix it, and so on. Sometimes they can also fix it themselves, I guess. But it's because I bring it up because I think a lot of what teams like that do is what we do, right? In the sense that we require similar tooling. And time travel debugging came out of kind of that organization to help customers, instead of sending crash dumps. Well, hey, if you can replicate that behavior, go capture a recording of it instead and send that to us, because it's more convenient for you. It's definitely more convenient for us. Maybe it's not so convenient for the customer, because now they have to go do that. But for the analyst, it saves invaluable time. The only thing that's really lacking with time travel debugging currently is there's no frameworks on top of it to automate analyses, to automate what you described in queries and so on. Like, I have my own that I built off of it, kind of naturally. I know that Microsoft had one internally. They deprecated it. I can't reveal the name, but we're missing features of that so we can kind of scale and automate. Like, for instance, like let's say we capture the trace of 10 different binaries related to a malware sample that we're dealing with. Well, how do we investigate all of them? Like we need to answer that problem, because the reality is most analysis is not done individually and isolated. You're like really never looking at a single file, right? It's usually in the context of something larger, or it's part of a file that has 1,000 different relations as well. So I think reversing and tooling needs to adapt to the reality of what it looks like for enterprises and companies, like Google and so on, because we're doing analysis at a massive scale. I don't want to look at one file. I want to look at millions. Well, how do I do that through a reversing lens? And I really think what I mentioned with like what I took you to really say with querying the execution when you're debugging it is we need to have data analysis for reversing. And we need to develop like technology that can do that. And I'm kind of going a bit more than the time travel aspect, because to me, the reason actually I do that, for me, the big takeaway when I got introduced to it, like meaningfully and usefully, is it wasn't so much about the debugging. It's like, man, I've been doing reversing horribly wrong. I need to query data. I need to structure the data. I need to cluster the data. And I just need to be able to ask the right questions or merge the right data sets in order to answer the questions of my analysis. And for me, that was a profound difference in how I approached analyses, especially for obfuscated malware and so on. If it's on Windows and it's user mode, but the default, without even like looking at it statically, I'll just go generate what's called a TTD trace. So the trace is what the terminology that they use when they capture this execution run and so on. It generates a .run file. That's like the trace file. It's a database, and then WinDBG can load this, and you can maneuver and so on and so through it. And the console debugger can also load it. Most people don't know this, but you have to pass the -Z, the Z switch, to have it load like a crash dump file, and it can do it because under the hood it's a little bit the same here of how WinDBG does it. And I bring that up because I primarily use the console debugger for WinDBG.
It's one of the, you can definitely tell the technology. I mean, an escalation engineer makes a lot of sense to me. You look at a lot of the official Microsoft literature and documentation, and there's not a lot out there when it comes to TTD. It really is geared towards, I think, what you just described, triaging bugs. It's great because it's a unified data set too. So if I get a good trace, I can share it with anyone, and we're all looking at the same exact thing. Remove some of the nuance and variation that you get, I'm sure, with all the Windows distributions that are out there, and so it's a great use case for that. And I think there's been some issues here and there. I know you've discovered some emulation bugs and some other issues in looking at malware. I don't know if those were necessarily because you were looking at malware or just because they just were overlooked. I mean, I suppose all software has bugs to a certain degree, but I think the adoption will certainly grow, and then just having that additional data set, I do think that's an interesting perspective, because I don't know, when you stop and think about it, it seems like a lot of my analysis is just contingent upon reading one line of assembly at a time and then trying to understand that and build that bigger picture. And that's of course what makes it feel like such a monolithic and sometimes very tedious task. And having this execution trace shifts that and makes it a little bit easier, because now I can query at a higher level and get down into the weeds as necessary and pinpoint program execution in a way that's different than when I approach things traditional debug, traditional static analysis in IDA.
Absolutely. I think doing what you just described, and we all do it, and we kind of don't have a choice, because again, the tooling is structured in such that is kind of the go-to abstraction that we have to deal with. But the reality is, unless we're microcode level, like microcode as in like how does Intel implement the actual ISA, unless we're those kinds of researchers, we don't really care about the instruction, right? Like I don't want to read sequential instructions one at a time in order to build a mental model, of what this malware is doing. It's horribly inefficient. It's a waste of time, and it doesn't address like what you as an analyst, as a reverser, bring to the table as it pertains to your skill set. Again, kind of going back to reading text and like, yeah, we know how to
I
do
was
it.
just going to say, I mean, we're kind of talking about reading textbooks, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like we know how to do it, but like no matter how good you are, it's always inefficient, right? And it's like there needs to be better abstractions and primitives that build off of it. And time travel debugging is certainly one aspect of it, but it's also very limited. Like it's in the context that initially it didn't really target security researchers and malware analysts, which I think was a shame, because that's probably outside of what I described, the escalation engineers who solve real problems with serious consequences. Security researchers benefit the most from this kind of technology, because we also deal with critical cases of malware, of exploits that we just would love to be able to, one, speed up, one, just be more efficient in the way that we do analysis, and they definitely help aid in solving those problems. So I think in general we need to shift or help companies and products that solve binary analysis shift in a direction of thinking large scale. And by that I mean, again, you don't want to look at individual instructions. You don't want to look at individual files, in my opinion. Why can't we take 1 million files and be able to automate the analysis of them, cluster and tag, kind of what you mentioned before, and when you were doing, as a professor, like tag and classify information, put that in clusters of databases, and allow us to query from it what we need in order to answer our goals. I think that's the direction that binary analysis needs to go to, especially in how we do it at companies like Google and others. I mean, there's the reality is that binary analysis, malware analysis, I mean, it's almost directly related to threat intelligence. And so to me, threat intelligence is almost exclusively done through data analysis, like with SQL queries where you have clusters of database. Like Microsoft, they have their own language, KQL, Kusto Query Language. They have the Kusto Explorer, and you can kind of just go crazy. You have clusters of databases you query, and so on and so forth, to do your threat intelligence, to do your incident response investigations, and so on. Where's reversing in that field? I have to go open up IDA, and it's incredibly antagonistic to that workflow. And again, no shades here at all. I mean, for me, I think I have huge respect, especially for product like Hexrays and IDA, because they basically commercially invented decompilation. Like they didn't just theorize about it. There was an actual company that was put together, right, to solve this problem. They had to make money. They had to. I mean, it's an incredible task, and to still innovate as you're doing that and doing this over 2 decades ago, and the product is like 3 decades. It's amazing. Like it just, there's no real shade to throw at anything like that. It's incredibly impressive, but it's not 2005, right? It's 2025. And we need to adjust with how we do analyses, especially at scale. Like, again, if you're looking at something individually, while maybe it's, interesting and you can learn from that, absolutely, I think we're missing the productivity and the impact that we can provide with the work that we do for the reasons that we do it. And I think it can be done. Like, one thing we can segue to quickly, if you wouldn't mind, is like decompilation. It's another thing that, again, praise to Hexrays, who kind of introduced it to the commercial space. Well, let's go back to defining terms and asking, simple foundational questions. Well, what is decompilation? In Hexray speak, what is pseudocode? What does this actually do? Like, what is the point of this abstraction? And how do they implement it? And how is this in conjunction with how a malware analyst actually solves their problems with this product? What does all that look like? And I begin, once you, again, not to take shade here anyway, just kind of thinking out loud, when you look at it, you realize pseudocode is also incredibly inefficient. Like, in order for IDA to generate pseudocode, they do incredible stuff. They take that raw disassembly, they know how to structure it, they have their own intermediate representation, their own IR, they incidentally call it microcode, and they have at least 8 stages of maturities in their speak where they kind of transform that code into what is eventually the end product, which is this decompiled output, which most malware analysts use to reason about their problems. Incredible abstractions being made, very rich data structures, like you have a micro block, which captures a kind of basic block of micro instructions. These are lifted as in you transition the syntactical structure of the disassembly to something more convenient. And you have very rich abstractions here. But the conclusion of this decompilation process is literally dumb text, right? The pseudocode output is just text, raw text, dumb text. It's useless. In the sense that as a primitive for an abstraction, it's just raw text. The best you can do is grep it, or regex it, and so on. Whereas, for instance, right below it, you have something they call the C tree, which is their abstract syntax tree, their AST, for how they represent the actual pseudocode once they kind of transition to their microcode maturities. And it's very semantically rich, Like, for instance, one thing I have asked is, how do you measure the complexity of a program? And a lot of times you hear stuff like word count, line count. This project has 1 million lines of code, but that doesn't necessarily give you a real understanding of the complexity. You can have 1 million lines of trivial code, right? Maybe tedious to process, but is it really complicated? And then I watched a talk from a language developer with a particular language called JAI. And he was asking the same question. And he was like, well, hey, I'm building my own compiler. And I'm also asking, like, what is a complicated piece of code? Well, I have this AST. I have this abstract syntax tree. So compilers generate ASTs as they're, transitioning the code to binary. And he's like, well, why don't I just measure each expression that I'm using? It's more semantically rich in answering this question. And I was like, well, wait a minute. I have the C tree. I have the exact same thing in essence. And so I kind of wrote a heat map for each function that counts the complexity, and I can kind of tell you what that means if you're interested. And I have a visual mapping, kind of like a mini map, a heat map specifically for the complexity of a function. And in the case of obfuscation, we can easily answer questions such as like, well, how do you know a function is obfuscated as opposed to one that is not? And you just have this vibrant color, basically, that's like this, just the entropy here is insane. Something's off here kind of thing. Again, it kind of minimizes and speeds up your analysis with identifying points that are interesting to follow and so on and so forth. But not to go on a tangent, I really think our tooling with how we reason about malware analysis, binary analysis, and so on, just solving problems around program behavior, we are in the dark ages in some sense. And I think we kind of, need to evaluate what getting out of it looks like. Again, going back to pseudocode, like if I were to ask you, what problem does it actually solve? Like, what would be your response? Because why do you need C-like text? Like there's another decompiler called Revenge, rev.ng. And one of their biggest selling points is like, hey, we produce valid C code. Awesome. Like that's I can understand that, but I'm not sure why this is important. Like, because the reality is, if you just had a C project, let's just take the inverse. Let's say we're doing source code analysis. It's a huge C project. And like, we just start off with text, raw text. There's a reason we need IDEs. We need language server protocols. We need stuff like Gemini Code Assist, Cursor, etc., and so on, because the raw text just sucks as a medium for us to, it's not semantically rich. Like, that's my whole point. So generating valid C code, while it may have the appearance of solving a problem, it's, I'm not sure what problem it actually solves, because really what we're asking is what syntactical representation is most beneficial to us. And that can be anything, right? That's kind of to be determined. It's not necessarily C code, C pseudo code, and so on. I mean, the reason most decompilers do this is just easier to generate, right? And you can mimic a lot of languages with C. It's just, C is very close to the hardware. It mimics really how you interact with, the ISA. So it kind of, that's a logical reason why they kind of do it. But all we're talking about is syntax, like a syntactical representation. And I bring this up and I'm kind of emphasizing it because to our theme of obfuscation, really, when you're de-obfuscating something, you need to preserve the semantics, right? Like you need to preserve what actually is going to happen. You can't change that. But what you need to change is how you view the problem. And that usually means viewing it in a different syntax. So very common to deobfuscation, even though we didn't discuss it, and I didn't deliberately do it like this with the ScatterBrain blog, is you want to create IRs, intermediate representations of your problem, because when you categorize that at a high level of what you're doing, what you're actually doing is not creating an IR, you're creating a different visualization for the syntax of your problem. And that's an incredibly powerful primitive to build off of and on top of. And it's actually very easy to make, IRs for particular contexts, and so on. Like if you want to make a product like LLVM, okay, that's a different problem. But for individual use cases for deobfuscation, it's actually pretty straightforward on what makes the most sense to do this. And usually it amounts to also a custom kind of AST that you would build out, a kind of logical relationship between nodes that is hierarchically structured. But I digress in case you have anything to say to any of that.
I don't know. I mean, there's a number of things that popped into my mind. I mean, just kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation, thinking about data and just comparing larger groups of being able to, I guess, work at scale. That was something that when I kind of ran across this issue early in my career, and in maybe a slightly more trivial context, but it still shocked me at how difficult it was. Parsing PE files is a very common task. Looking at different properties, characteristics. I know there's vhashes and VirusTotal are built loosely off of that. I'm not sure all the details there. When I wanted to say, okay, I'm just interested in how I have a sample, and I think there's something about it that is familiar. Maybe it relates to another sample I looked at. I had absolutely no way of drawing that distinction or that correlation. And we have all these PE parsing utilities out there, and they're great in what they do, but they're only one file at a time. They're just continuing to kind of propagate this problem in a way. And so I had this idea. I don't know if you're ever heard of or familiar with the Archemy project, but it's network traffic capture, and it parses like a network parsing tool would, but then it indexes a lot of the important aspects of, say, the headers and different parts of the packet, and puts it in Elastic. And so it makes your ability to now look at this large mountain of network traffic data almost, I mean, it's just easier, much easier to group things into buckets and to look for patterns and to look at things that connect and are related. And I thought, man, this has got to be, I've got to have this for files. And so I started building this project for PE files. I just we'll parse it. We'll maybe generate some new data. We'll put it into something like Elastic, and we'll put this nice UI that just basically says, I'm not really doing anything more than allowing you to take any property, any field, anything that's inside of the database, and now you can make that part of your search and your query, and just looking at the data, connecting the dots. And unfortunately, the project never took off, but it's out there on GitHub if anybody wants to check it out. I still kind of wish I had that, because there still just isn't great tools that allow me to do that. And I don't know if that solves things at Google scale, but certainly I think it would, it would certainly help my individual analysis that I think would then ultimately help my larger scale analysis. So I don't know. It's just interesting as you're talking, as we're talking about this single, a lot of reverse engineering is just a single file approach, and the limitations inherent with that kind of work. And just, it's just a different way of thinking about it. I'm glad we've been able to talk about it for so long. Well, what else? I guess now we're kind of rounding into 2 hours. I mean, we've covered a lot of what was on our agenda. Is there any area that I haven't, taken us into that you wanted to spend more time in, or any new topics?
Yeah, I mean, again, your call. I can go for hours. There's so much to talk about. So much interest, like everything especially what you mentioned about this project. That you mentioned you were the one who built this, right? Yeah. I mean,
well, credit where credit is due. It was kind of born out of that frustration that I just described, and it also then I was able to, because I was at the university at the time. I was actually able to get a little bit of funding for it from the NSA, and was able to hire at least one student, I believe, who did a phenomenal job of just designing and helping build some of the framework. And he was a big fan of Docker and other things that I wasn't really using all that heavy at the time. And actually, it was kind of an extension. I had a project that I had worked on previous with a colleague at HP, and I had found this wealth of, I mean, kind of going back to the orb weaver discussion, when I was first getting into malware analysis and reversing, I had no idea where to start. And part of how I was trying to figure out where to go was just emulating what I was seeing on social media. And at the time, Twitter had this very active InfoSec community, and exploit kits were this big thing. And I saw this guy, Brad Duncan, and his malware traffic analysis, always posting about exploit kits. And I actually reached out. I wasn't able to get a response, but I thought, okay, how do I find these exploit kits? And so I started packing together Python scripts. I was previously I was a web developer, so I had a lot of experience with web technologies, and it wasn't that hard to hack together some atrocious Python to just start crawling the internet. But it's like, I can't just crawl the internet. I have to have some intentionality behind why I'm crawling the internet. But the crazy thing about these exploit kits was they were so prolific. I mean, I could pull chunks of websites from the top 1 million most trafficked sites, and I would find exploit kits active on those sites. It was insane. But I was just surprised. I was surprised at how prolific they were, and just the dead end then that provides. Well, how did they get on this site? Well, they compromised it in some way, shape, or form. Where did the compromise come from? At one point we were theorizing it was compromised WordPress packages and plugins and themes that people were downloading. I mean, certainly they're not all just vulnerable WordPress sites that are getting compromised, and all these research questions that I wasn't able to really answer. But I guess it's a long answer just to say that I started building, and this is also out on GitHub, a web crawler, because simultaneously I was finding open directories and how much stuff, at least at the time, some of these threat actors were leaving in these open directories, and made a very modular system to, I guess it really ties into what we were discussing. I wanted to not only be able to identify them, but then classify what we were looking at, use things like Yara and others to identify payloads and identify content that was hosted there, and try to put it into buckets of interest. And then ultimately I wanted that to fit into this PE parsing framework that I wanted to be much broader than just PE files. I wanted it to be Office documents, and then you could connect the dots. Now we have this PE parsing thing that was actually, it's got a CAPE integration. So now you can get dynamic analysis. You can see if maybe you can get it to talk on the network, where it was connected to. Now, did I scrape that site earlier? Did I associate a web panel with it because I was able to identify some of the web panel? And I had this whole grand vision of things that I wanted to put together. So I guess that's kind of the whole backstory there. Welcome to the podcast about me.
No, this is amazing. I'm glad you're sharing this, especially when you're saying like, okay, you want to do like PE file parsing, but what about Office documents and other file formats? Because definitely at least I have been trying to be like, okay, binary analysis and obfuscated compiled binaries. That was also intentional because there's scripting languages, there's Office document files, there's Word document files, and so on. So there's a whole plethora of interesting components, let's say, that attackers can leverage for nefarious purposes. And I think it's also illuminating to point out what you said, like you can just like find these exploit kits, like like anywhere on the internet kind of thing. And I think that the relevance of that is because a lot of perception, I think, just people not in the industry, in the space, like they think like everything related to malware or everything related to cyber attacks is extremely sophisticated. It's very well thought out, and a lot of times it's just some kids, wreaking havoc. That also is true. Most of them not probably sure what they're even trying to achieve, and so on. And some attacks you may have like dedicated like resources to it, like nation state actors that are still kind of just like that because they don't care. They target so many en masse. They know parts of it will stick, or the parts that they kind of care about, whatever they do. And you'll find a lot of stuff like that out and about, which also makes it again scary because the average user may not be, uh, perceptive to that, and then can, easily get compromised, or their machines, their devices, and so on. But no, this is excellent stuff, and I support it. I love what you do as far as sharing information. I know I have been critical here of academia, but I have not been so critical of, like you mentioned, you were finding stuff basically on social media. It's fantastic. It's amazing. I love these decentralized platforms like that, where just any individual can contribute to, and anybody across the world with internet access to that can benefit from it. It's incredibly powerful. Where I think a lot of stuff in academia is extremely centralized. It's around, pompous degrees, and that don't mean anything. Like, I've done interviews too many to count. I've never looked at educational background as a meaningful criteria, right? Like, it's, because I'm not sure what it would tell me. Whereas if, let's say, I discuss it with you and you kind of give me the context that you had as you were exploring, like you said, you didn't even know where to start with model analysis. You saw some social media pickings and just kind of followed a trail, made your own trail, and so on. I think this is really what is realistic to how people learn this stuff. And hearing it from a professional, an experienced individual, I think is very impactful, or can be. And kudos to all the others who share information on YouTube, on, X, Mastodon, Reddit, whatever, Blue Sky, whatever the platforms are. Too many to count these days, and you got to be sensitive with which ones you name. But it's all good for me. It's like sharing information like that, which you think is valuable, is an incredible learning opportunity for individuals. And huge kudos to those that put serious effort behind it, in the presentation, in organizing everything, creating GitHubs or sites or whatever, because it's an incredible amount of work. Like, I highly respect that, and it's no, I'm happy that you share that.
Yeah. It's I think for me personally, it feels like a way of paying it forward to say thank you to all of the folks that did it before me, because there was so much scattered information out there. There were times where I'd pick up a Windows internal book and it'd be one paragraph that saved my day. Another time it would be a blog post. Another time it'd be a conference talk. And so it's just such a big part of our profession, and it's easy to take for granted. It's easy to overlook. Certainly, as the years have gone by, where there may be less written content, there's still more content out there than there's ever been. I would say to anybody who ever asks me, you might get some haters, but don't let that be a barrier. More people will appreciate the effort and the sincerity of wanting to share knowledge, that nothing needs to be perfect. You don't have to worry about somebody that is, top of the field going out of their way to come and criticize you. And if they do, well, then that speaks about them. So, share, just get it out there and do your best to make it comprehensible and thorough and thoughtful, and it'll take care of itself. So,
yeah, I mean, just quick point to that. Like, to me, if you're genuine about it, you're passionate about it, it means something for you to do it. Sure, we should listen to critique. I think it's not wise to just ignore critique. If it's slander, I mean, like you said, it's too many to count. You can just, of course, ignore that. But I think it's good to hear genuine critique. But even then, like, if you want to be oblivious to it, because what you're doing matters to you, and you're genuine about it, you're doing this sincerely because you care about it. And maybe people also do it to kind of stroke their egos. What's wrong with that? We all have egos, like, there's a great book. I don't know if it's in the book, but like, it's from the 2008 like Olympic basketball team, like the NBA, not the NBA, Olympics, so the U.S. Men's Basketball League in 2008, which Coach K from Duke University, and I loved what he said about ego. He's like, well, I'm a college coach, and I'm dealing primarily kids, so I kind of have this father-like figure that I can, in a sense, impose on them, and so on. I'm not quoting him verbatim. I'm kind of paraphrasing some parts, but I say that because, well, now you have grown men, right, in the NBA, make a lot of money, right? Like, who are you to kind of tell them anything? And well, he's like, well, I have a problem. I'm trying to win this Olympic medal, and we need to be a team, kind of like what we discussed earlier about being in a team environment and so on. And he was like, well, a lot of these individuals have egos, naturally so. They're probably the best at what they do, so there's something that comes with it. And it was just profound to me when he was just like, well, don't leave your ego at the door. Otherwise, we're not getting the real, authentic, genuine you. Bring your ego through the door. If your ego has to take a seat next to you, well, so be it, right? Like, we're here to solve a problem as a team. And for us to be successful in that endeavor, we need transparency. So if that baggage comes with you, well, it better be right next to you, because then we get a real glimpse of that. And so to me, even individuals who may share content and so on, not just in our space, but in general for that purpose, you know what? So what? I don't see the issue with that, so long as the content that you're delivering is, genuine, and you care about what you're doing, and you should take pride in what you're doing. I think education is an amazing thing that people invest time into, and it's a shame, particularly in the U.S., how little money is invested in that regard. Maybe you can blurt that out of the podcast, but because to me it's unbelievably critical for exactly the reasons you mentioned. It's such a powerful medium, and I think having this space through the internet. I mean, the internet to me is just an incredible invention, and like just opens up so many doors, right, for us as a global society to interact, communicate, share knowledge with us, grow as human beings, and so on. So anybody partaking in that genuinely and willing to put their time, their effort into that, in my opinion at least, deserves a huge amount of respect. And I wish we could start investing a lot of money into those people so they could do it more often, and we could get more to join him and build institutions out of it, and so on. But again, I digress.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you're not, I'm not saying everybody needs to go set up a blog. There's tons of overhead, there's cost, all that stuff. But if you're not contributing it, you're not having a voice in the collective internet knowledge and discussion and conversation. And so, it seems like something that we all have to be at least aware of, especially in our professional capacities. So it is for a lot of people, though, a labor of love. And I don't know the right answer to. I know for me personally, I have a desire to just share what I learn, and hopefully it is helps illuminate paths quicker for others. We've had a great long conversation here. It covered a lot of ground, and I think it's probably safe to say, time to wrap it up. Thank you again for your time and all of your insights and all of the work that you've been doing. And I know it's had a profound impact for a lot of folks out there. Last thoughts, words for you. If anyone wants to get a hold of you, is there any way that you like to be contacted, or I guess just, the floor is yours to wrap things up and take us out of the episode.
Yeah, no, thank you, Josh, and thank you for the opportunity and sharing the space here together for the time that we did. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you having pushed this and made this something public, this whole podcast, and exposing people to, I think, a reality most are just not privy to, for kind of obvious reasons, because a lot of the work we do is secretive in nature and so on, which is kind of, again, antagonistic to what we discussed about sharing information and knowledge and so on, but kind of unavoidably so. So it's actually amazing that you kind of adapted to what is a modern medium, right? This podcast medium, and presented our work, our discussions in that manner, and so on. So no, huge kudos and massive respect to you for that, and everything that you do. As far as contacting me, rather don't. I prefer to lurk here in the shadows, so to speak. Okay. And so not much really to add from me. But no, I really appreciate the time and the effort and the commitment on your part for putting all of this together.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, I'm going to hit end. Thank you, Nino. It was a great conversation. I can't wait for the rest of the world to hear it. And that's all for this episode of Behind the Binary. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It really helps us to reach new listeners. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring.